Hi, yes, so my name is Larissa and I'm a postdoc in Giulio's lab. And what I want to talk about in the 5 minutes that I have is to bridge what Max told you about measuring integrated information at the level of quarks and the Hamiltonian, and where we measure integrated information, which is the level of neurons, sort of. And it's motivated by, so Giulio told you about integrated information and the axioms, the characteristics of conscious experience. And the work I present is motivated by the last of those, the exclusion postulate, that says that every experience you have is unique. It is only one in content, and it has a particular spatial and temporal grain. So we measure integrated information, and that spatio-temporal grain should correspond to the level of description where integrated information reaches a maximum. So every system can be described at potentially a lot of different spatio-temporal grain sizes. And for the brain, the relevant scales of causal interaction reach from molecules that interact to neurons, groups of neurons, and different brain areas. And at the temporal scale, we have relevant interaction at milliseconds, tens of milliseconds, brain areas over hundreds of milliseconds, and also long-term interactions in the order of seconds or even longer. So for consciousness, we believe that based on a lot of experiments, the spatial and temporal scale that our consciousness runs at is probably neurons, groups of neurons at the spatial level, and about 100 to 200 milliseconds at in temporal scale. So that means that if we measure integrated information across all the levels, starting from quarks to neurons, where it should reach the maximum should be exactly that level. So in some sense, we're quite happy that Max didn't find a higher value, because you should have a highest level of integrated information at that spatio-temporal scale. And I will try to give you a solution on how we think it's possible to actually measure more causal power at a macro level than at a micro level of description. But even if you don't agree with anything else that I'm going to say, just realize that there is a problem, that consciousness runs at this large macro spatio-temporal scale, and that has to be explained in some way. So the problem is that if you describe something at the micro level, the possible available information is very large. It's for the systems that I'm going to talk about, discrete binary with discrete binary microunits, the number of the available information is just the log number of 2 of all the possible states of the system. So if you coarse grain or across time or space, you will definitely have lower available information because you just have less elements, okay? But if there is some indeterminism in the system, or if there's degeneracy, the information that can be specified by the physical mechanisms is much lower than the possible available information. And the solution to the problem how you can have a higher causal power would be to have a causal measure that is dependent on the state space, on the size of the state space, but also on the effectiveness of the mechanisms. So that it can happen that a macro level of description, by counteracting the indeterminism or degeneracy in that system, has a higher effectiveness that is so high that it offsets the decrease in state space that you necessarily have by coarse graining the system. And so it will be a measure of causal emergence. And the problem of causal emergence is that we totally agree that if you have the micro level of description, all available information is there. So it's not that something magical is going to happen at the macro level. The macro level does supervene on the micro level. So in principle, you can infer everything from the micro level, and once the micro is fixed, so is the macro. But crucial is that it doesn't necessarily mean that the micro level is the best level of description then. So the problem is, though, that you cannot have causation at all the levels at once, because then you would count causes double. So the typical reductionist assumption is that because all the information is there at the micro level, all the other levels don't actually do any causal work, but they just are useful descriptions. I won't really tell you much more about how we measure things, except that we have this causal measure that takes into account both the effectiveness of the system and the size of the state space. And in systems that show degeneracy and noise, as in a neural system like that, where we have a lot of interacting microlevels that have rules that just fire spontaneously like neurons in the brain, but they also have causal interactions that are powerful in groups. So if you coarse grain the system into, let's say, these three macro structures, measuring the effective information at both levels, you will find that the causal, that there is causal emergence in the sense that there is actually more effective information at the macro level than at the micro level. And this means that though the system does supervene, the macro system does supervene on the micro level, there is causal emergence, and the macro system supersedes the micro system because the causal power is higher at the macro level. And to avoid the overcausation, we would then, it would then follow that the level that you have to exclude is the micro level, and all the other levels that you can possibly coarse grain the system at, and only keep the maximum level where the causal interactions are highest. And I put those question marks there because, of course, the level that we start with is a discrete system with interacting binary units, and you should, I mean, I was listening careful to all your talks so far, and it seems to me that there's still a lot of debate going on what the actual ultimate micro level is, so we don't know. But this is a way to really quantify causal emergence across the levels.
Thank you. Let's thank Larissa for her talk.
Good morning. I'm a new kid in the block. I'm not a professional researcher, though I was trained in physics. I got interested in consciousness about 30 years ago when I started a company doing artificial neural networks. And at some point along that journey, I asked myself, can I make a conscious computer? And I have a tentative answer already, which is no. And in some way, the work that Giulio has shown today would provide support to that, because you can have essentially a zombie, which is that feed-forward network that has the same input-output state, and another system that is actually conscious, having the same input-output state. So, but let me give you, before I go into further hypotheses that I have about consciousness, let me give you the sense that I have, what I would define consciousness myself. Basically, I see consciousness as the interplay of four fundamental and irreducible aspects. It's like four facets of a whole. By the way, the issue of integration has come out very, very clearly this morning, being the critical issue. The first is perception, sensate perception. How come that we have qualia? How come certain information produces sensations? What is the physical principle that allows to take electrical activity in the brain and produce sensations? We don't know. But even more important, the next aspect of consciousness is the aspect of comprehension. I call comprehension understanding, but it's an understanding that connects the most dots. In other words, you can understand things by connecting a few dots, dots meaning qualia, or connecting a maximally number of dots, and that I call comprehension. Consciousness can actually comprehend, can understand. You probably, you know, sometimes you learn, you get the information, you get the knowledge, but you don't understand it. There is a moment of understanding where things kind of come together, they integrate, and it's like an aha. That's in a fundamental property of consciousness. The third element is free will. Consciousness is about making decisions on the comprehension. In other words, qualia provides like a display where you have the basic sort of primary meaning which is being processed by the sensory brain system, like in a multi-dimensional display. Comprehension is making connections between the various qualia into a understanding, deep understanding, the maximal understanding. Upon that understanding, you then make free will decisions. They are the best that you can do out of a repertoire of decisions that you could make based on the comprehension. And that impacts your actions into the world. And finally, there is the concept of identity. Identity means being identified within yourself as yourself. It's a very special, actually it's perceived as a qualia, but it is a form of integration, of unification of your experience. You experience as that identity, as a self. So those four elements are interdependent, interconnected, and they create the phenomenon of consciousness. So now if we look at what would be required from a physical system for consciousness to emerge out of atoms banging against each other, I banged my head against the wall many times and I could not figure out at all how that would be possible. I don't think it is an algorithmic process. I don't think that you can make a Turing machine conscious. But that's my belief. It has to be demonstrated. That's a hypothesis. But the reason is that I believe that consciousness, like Max mentioned this morning, is some other physical property that we have yet to identify. Something perhaps in the quantum vacuums, I don't really know. But it has to be something new that hasn't been identified yet. Some power, some capacity of quantum vacuum, I don't know, that actually has some essential awareness. It's like information is somehow shared within this type of energy, let's call it conscious energy, I don't know. But it has to be something in addition to what we know. In fact, the state of matter that Tegmark was talking this morning, Max, we don't know what it is. So, you know, so why don't we look into that? So if we do that, then obviously we can begin to see that perhaps the evolution of the universe is actually a co-evolution of this aspect, of this conscious aspect, if we want to call it. By the way, this is not panpsychism, nor is it, you know, dualism. I'm talking about there is like an inner aspect and an outer aspect of reality that co-evolve together. They sort of co-evolve. So as matter can become more and more complex, it reflects aspects of evolution of this something that is reflected by that complexity. And so the two drive each other. So that's it. That's my sense of what might be possible to explain consciousness. Thank you.
Thank you, Federico.
Oh.
Thank you. Any questions specifically for Federico before we move on to the panel discussion?
Would it be possible in your view, to take a Turing machine and enhance it with the quantum vacuum power to make it conscious as well?
I don't know really, because I don't know what that property is, frankly. But I think that that's like a place to look. In other words, I'm simply, you know, here we are physicists, and you know, I don't believe that you're going to find that special property, you know, with Hamiltonians or within, you know, within the sort of the properties that we know. I rack my brain trying to figure it out. I don't think it's there. There is something else that actually co-evolves with, you know, in other words, the physical structure can contain that consciousness that is evolving, co-evolving with it, is co-emergent and co-evolving.
What I'd like to ask the panel to do, which is almost as hard as not quite as hard as the hard problem of consciousness itself, but it's still nevertheless a hard problem, is to give me one sentence on what they mean by consciousness. Larissa.
I would say that consciousness is a very beautiful, high-dimensional structure of all your intrinsic concepts.
Thank you, beautifully said. Federico.
Consciousness is physics that we do not yet know.
Lived experience.
My definition is the same as Christof's, the lived experience. What I'm guessing that it is information being processed in some very complicated way, including integration as one of the requirements.
There are a lot of semicolons.
Lots of semicolons. And finally, Giulio, one sentence on
May I answer the question?
Of course.
Have you been listening?
Have you all been listening?
Let's double on Tom.
We saw in Christian's talk the experiments that have been done using fMRI and EEG on subjects, and these are on individual subjects. But I mean, for me, how do I know, Christian, that the pink of your shirt that I see is the pink that everyone else sees? How do I know that my qualia are the same as the qualia here in the room?
Okay, so it's Christof, by the way.
Sorry.
That's okay. So in philosophy, there's this well-known. So this is what philosophers do. They have these arguments, inverted spectrum argument. Everything could be the same when green. What you call green, I call red. What I call red, you call green, and the world would be the same. And other philosophers claim there's a psychologist time that you can actually test for that. But in general, how do we know we see things similar? Well, because if you come to my lab and I show you certain palettes of colors, you respond in similar ways, your same photoreceptors get active. If you have a single point mutation, you have a single amino acid that's changed in one of your photoreceptors, you will respond in a lawful way, you will see something different. But among men, there are two different alleles in the photopigment corresponding to red, that half the men see red slightly different by 2 nanometers. It's not random, it's very predictable. They have predictable psychophysical effects. They have predictable physiological effects. So there seems to be this highly lawful relationship between my inner world and your inner world of experience and the outer world. Yes, you could imagine in principle all the labels could be relabeled, but there really wouldn't be any fundamental difference. The fundamental reality is these are very lawful relationships that we can now begin to manipulate at the molecular level.
Okay, thank you. Right, I shall open up the discussion here. Lots of hands. Why don't we start at the back? Sorry, Brendan.
So we've heard about the effort to recreate consciousness in a machine. And I must say, if you were able to recreate consciousness in a machine, I would think then you would be able to say, now we really understand what consciousness is all about. And it has presumably something to do with a certain level of complexity, a certain level of feedback, and so on and so forth. But what happens when you finally succeed and the robots rise up and rebel against us, and since they're able to evolve much more rapidly than a biological system, what happens then? Are you heading us towards the next extinction?
We actually have a session for that on Thursday afternoon on existential risk and a whole essay contest we're launching. So why don't we hold that until then, right?
Anyone else got a comment besides Max?
I would ask a question to the panel. Do we need a body in order to be conscious?
Maybe I can say something. So we don't need behavior at all to be conscious or not, but we wouldn't have the brain that we have if we wouldn't have grown up with a body that learned the things that we learned. So to get to the brain that we have, we needed to interact. So somebody who was never able to walk, or somebody who cannot see from birth, does not have the quality vision or movement that we have. But if you grew up with having all that and then by an accident you get paralyzed, there is no need for your body to be able to move anymore. You would still be conscious.
I agree, and just to add to that, one thing I take away from the integrated information theory of consciousness is that just like there can be very many different kinds of liquids that satisfy your definition of being a liquid, there are a vast variety of different kinds of conscious perceptions that all satisfy the definition of being conscious, and we shouldn't be so hung up on just equating conscious experience with our kind of experience. If you're some very limited kind of conscious system, a photodiode or some system which is almost disconnected from the outside world, it's probably not going to have sort of richness to it that your internal world does. Maybe it'll just feel green the entire time or something like that. But it would still feel it, and in that sense it would still be conscious.
But the short answer would be yes, you need a mechanism. Without mechanism, there cannot be any conscious experience.
I'll try and answer your initial question in a slightly better way now. So what is consciousness in a sentence by a word? Shape. So an experience is a shape. This addresses also your question about the pinkness of Christof and your statement about the possibility that there are many different kinds of consciousness out there. And it also addresses a classic statement by a philosopher again, Thomas Nagel, who sort of pointed out how in his mind, science would never be able to solve the problem once again, because we'll never know whether bats are conscious and how, especially how. Let's say his essay in the 70s was, what is it like to be a bat? Now, according to this approach, which is very much in its infancy, so we mostly deal with quantity, only initially with quality, but just think of each experience as a shape. In the qualia space, is shape made of integrated information where each aspect of it is a concept. And we try to illustrate for simple systems what it is like. Now, obviously, the shapes get more interesting the more symmetries you break. And ours is extraordinary, and nobody can describe that, but it's a geometrical object in some sense. The beauty about that, if you develop the approach of mathematics, becomes in fact a matter of mathematics, is that you can ask how similar are two experiences, because it's a question about how similar are two shapes. So I can ask how similar is my experience of pink from Max's experience of pink. You see the same scene on the TV. I have my shape in here, he has his shape in there. We can ask in principle, now, are those shapes similar to what extent, etc. Does he have an inverted symmetry, which is very likely, in fact, he's a physicist and so forth. And so on and so forth. We can even ask, what is it like for a bat to use echolocation? So I could ask now the question, does it feel more like vision or does it feel more like sound? After all, in the brain, who knows, etc., etc. Well, there is a definite answer to that. We should be able to look at the shapes that correspond to the experience and ask, what's that shape? Is it more like our visual shapes or our auditory shapes, or is something in between that is none of the above? Okay? That kind of question can be asked. You can even ask, and I'll stop there, between two experiences of yourself, this one and the next one, this one and one we had yesterday night in the luminescent pool. Is that how different from the other one? There is a metric for that, and you can basically start doing that. We have been doing this all the time. Poets, but today they try to describe experiences and use so many words, but it's difficult to use words to describe mathematical shape of that dimensionality.
Let's move on. Oh, sorry.
Yes, I would like to say a few words. My sense of it is that a conscious experience relies on a structure, on some mechanism. And the nature of that experience is related to the nature of that mechanism. However, that doesn't mean that there could be consciousness without a specific, if it's true that consciousness is a property, some property of the quantum vacuum, let's say, that we don't yet know, then that property can still exist without any mechanism yet. In other words, it's still not expressed in a mechanism. Yeah. And therefore, it could exist as a potential.
Okay, lots of hands going up. There's let's
Okay, so I'm still, so I appreciate everybody's definition of consciousness. So what I'm taking away is awareness, that you're aware of the situation, some association, but not intelligence. It has nothing to do with intelligent behavior, where often Turing machine, the issues can't do intelligent things. So my understanding from the panel is that what we're talking about is awareness, not intelligent behaviors. Is that correct?
Okay, so it's a very interesting question, the relationship between consciousness and intelligence. So this gets to a question that we haven't at all talked about, which is why did consciousness evolve, right? We find ourselves in a world where we're a very complicated creature and we have high level of consciousness. So this is where the link with intelligence can be made. The argument is if you have a system that has a high degree of integrated information and you have another set of organisms, let's say bugs, animals, simple animals, that have low level of integration. So high level of integration means you take information from many different modules, from many different sources, and integrate it, correlate it together, come to a conclusion. While if you're if you're an organism that has a set of isolated information, encapsulated information that is less able to combine information. So with Giulio and I and Chris Adami here, we've done simulation of sort of simulated life, where you take a particular environment and you evolve creatures in it for hundreds of thousands of generations.
I know, but
wait, let me just finish.
Hospitalists didn't go to that level.
Wait, let me just finish. So here you have animals where you can show that the extent to which they adapt to their environment, the extent to which they develop intelligence relative to their environment correlates with their integrated information. In other words, the bug, the animal that has a higher level of integrated information, therefore a higher level of consciousness, is more adapted, is more intelligent in manipulating that environment than a bug that has less level of intelligence. So that would be the evolutionary driver of why creatures with high consciousness, such as we have, also have a high level of intelligence.
But would you have to add another axiom or something related to time to have intelligence?
Well, no, in this case it's just evolutionary time. You have different generations, succeeding generation of succeeding organisms. Each one has a particular phi, and the phi increases as these organisms adapt better and better to their environment, and they change the underlying wiring of their brains.
Yeah, I want to say something to that too. That is that intelligence is, in theory, neither necessary nor sufficient for consciousness. But in practice, there is a relation, because if you try to build a system to solve a complex task, it will become more efficient, and integrated systems will have advantages in solving that task, and thus will be more likely to evolve, while, like, for example, solving the same task with a preferred system needs much more elements and much more time.
But a lot of the discussion here seems to be this: can we make a computer that acts like a human, that does everything a human does, right? And a human does a lot more than just being conscious.
But I think we showed that you can have a functionally equivalent system that's either conscious or not. So
Let
Mark start a comment here.
Just want to add one more comment on the intelligence and awareness issue that came up here. So from a physicist's perspective, if we look at shapes, in the more broad sense, just shapes in space-time, patterns in space-time, what are the most complex ones that we have there? Well, you all know that the most complex space-time pattern we've ever discovered is the one you have in your head. If you look at the space-time pattern that all your sodium ions make, as they go in and out of membranes and neurons, it makes this incredibly elaborate braid pattern in space-time, which is vastly more complicated than the sun, for example. And so if you equate, if you think heuristically that intelligence should involve complicated shapes and patterns, that already seems very encouraging for the ideas that Giulio expressed. Now, will there be awareness generally whenever you have complexity? Giulio argued that no, you will not. But he showed this beautiful example of two equivalent circuits that have the same input-output behavior. Right? One of them, the sort of clunky, brute force Google approach to feed-forward networks, which was the best they could get to work so far. And then another one, which did the same thing, which you noted was actually much more efficient. So that's the one Scott Aronson would prefer, right? Uses fewer qubits. And that connects exactly with Christof Koch's evolutionary argument. Evolution is going to pick whichever method does the job. It's going to prefer whatever method does the job with the smallest number of resources. And I think that would give hope that evolved life generally tends to not be zombie life. Another argument for that would be if it turns out that error correction is actually useful in physical systems, as I was arguing in my talk, integration and error correction are really two aspects of the same thing. And there's a good reason why we build in error correction into our cell phone transmissions and into barcodes and all sorts of other stuff. And it's not at all implausible that that's something which evolution has also decided to be useful. And maybe that's also another evolutionary reason why
my brain is encrypted, so the NSA can't read it.
Lots and lots of hands here, so let's take another question. There's another one right at the back, Brendan.
So I'm thinking about the distinction between consciousness and memory of consciousness. So when you are anesthetized, sometimes people have worried, are you really not experiencing the pain of surgery, or are you just not able to move and not able to describe or recall the pain of surgery? And if so, is the anesthetic still better than if you could move and recall it? If that's still when we think about consciousness and morality, especially when we talk about radically different types of consciousness, like access, like a photoreceptor, that's consciousness is just hearing. Although I'm not quite sure I'm convinced of that as an idea. But I guess I want to ask about, in everyday life, there's a lot of systems that we're not sure about whether they're conscious, and this seems entangled with we're not sure whether it's morally okay or not, whether it's anesthetic in surgery or putting a stone in someone's shoe, which causes pain, and they don't experience that pain, or they are not conscious of that pain, but they're conscious of the relief when they take the shoe off. Are you doing something nice for someone when you put a stone in their foot, in their shoe, which causes relief, which they are conscious of, when they take their shoe off, or are you doing something not nice for them?
So I'm not sure about the stone in the shoe, but I can tell you historical anecdotes when people they discovered paralyticum, like curare, the poison used by American Indians. People used it as anesthesia, and then it took self-experimentation by some courageous anesthesiologists to realize that exactly what curare does, it paralyzes you, but it doesn't anesthetize you. So we have other ways of telling whether you have pain. If you have pain, even though you can't move, you'll release stress hormones, particular parts of your brain will light up, particular parts of activity will occur. So we have external ways of measuring whether this patient in front of me who's unable to signal because he's paralyzed or she's anesthetized, hopefully, is having conscious experience, including the experience of pain.
And if you have ever been drunk, some people may tell you that you were conscious then when you were talking to them, but you remember nothing.
And finally, I think all of these are beautiful examples of why this research that you, Christof, and you, Giulio, and you, Larissa, are doing is so important, because there are real practical questions where this matters. And yet another one is, if Ray Kurzweil decides to upload himself into some computer that he's built one day, I would recommend he talk with you first, Giulio. Make sure it's not a feed-forward network only. You'd be a perfect zombie.
Right, lots more questions. Andrew Briggs has a question.
Thanks very much. I was very stimulated by the new dimensions of consciousness that Federico brought into his presentation. And I would love to ask the other panel members how their mathematical and physical and material pictures of consciousness would fit into that framework. And I suppose I'm thinking in particular of the components that Federico was touching on that have to do with personhood, free will, responsibility, belief, those kinds of concepts that go into, what should we call it, the dignity of the person. How do these other mathematical tools of consciousness contribute to those kinds of bigger questions?
apropos the free will, maybe we have an entire panel this afternoon?
We have an entire panel on free will.
I was reluctant to mention that one because I don't want to get into that particular alley for the very reason you said. It's a whole topic in itself. But I was more, if you like, to rephrase my question, how do these mathematical and material models map onto human dignity?
In what, I mean, do you mean in the sense they remove the classical soul that people thought for the longest? Or in what sense do you mean that question?
I mean, it seems to me that we've been learning about some very valuable and very sophisticated intellectual tools this morning. And there are the bigger questions of what it means to be a person and to give dignity to another person, for which I think I would want to include their consciousness as a component of that dignity. And therefore I'd like to explore how we can draw on these new advances, on the descriptions of consciousness, for these bigger questions of human dignity.
So the only thing I can recommend is that you read the book by the Dalai Lama on ethics for the 21st century. It's really this Buddhist point of view that you should respect, you should have the utmost respect for any sentient being. Not just for people, not just for people and dogs and cows and lambs, but for all conscious creatures. And from that flows a lot of implication for ethics, for all sorts of experimentation, what you eat and how you treat things in the environment.
Well, one more comment on this also, from my perspective. If you ask how should these ideas change the way we think about ourselves and the way we feel about ourselves, in particular, should we feel better about ourselves or worse about ourselves? If can ultimately, thanks to your work, understand ourselves as complex shapes in space-time. I think we should feel better about ourselves, actually, for the reason Larissa mentioned. Because what sounds kind of depressing and a bit like a bit of a downer by saying, oh, I'm just my quirks, is sort of the implication that the fact that they're put together this way, these quirks doesn't really add anything to them. And this, if we take the opposite point of view, which I think was coming from this, is that what we in physics call emergence, and the phenomenon of substrate independence is really, really core. Now, we have some examples of sort of classic bottom-up reductionism, where you start from the bottom and that's what really matters, and then work out what happens. We see many cases where the things that emerge from that, like the waves in the ocean and the sound waves that let you hear me right now, are close to substrate independent. You can start studying the properties of these waves with the Navier-Stokes equations to great accuracy without even caring about what kind of molecules are filling this room. And so in Larissa's language, the explanatory power here, most of what's going on about waves is described at this macro level in a rather substrate independent way. It doesn't matter what is the wave in. The wave is moving through the room. Now it's the back where you heard it, but the air molecules didn't move. It was the wave that moved. And in the same way, one of the feel-good things I take away from your work here is that consciousness is the same kind of entity. It doesn't really much matter whether I'm made of some mushy neurons or exactly the low-level details of this. Even Hopfield made this point, because the causal explanatory power, much like waves, is really at the macro level of when you sort of identify with what you are, with yourself.
So my short presentation should bridge the gap between consciousness and free will, in the sense that if our consciousness is the level of highest integrated information, that means that the causes and effects that happen in your brain at that level have the highest causal power. So that means that the conscious decision you take does supervene on the micro level, but it is the one that has the highest causal power. So it cannot really be reduced to the micro things that happen in your brain, but it actually is your decision that makes you do something.
Yeah, I make one quick comment, because this is a question that requires an entire meeting on this session. So just a couple of snapshots here. One is, the whole point here is that consciousness is irreducible once we properly define
define what reducibility means. And it is reducible the whole to the parts and the levels to the micro levels. But perhaps more importantly, in the general sense of human dignity, there are too many things to say, but one that is obvious from such an approach is that you need to be that particular shape. It requires an extraordinary physical substrate to be that shape. But if you were not conscious, and you were not conscious in that more and more complex way, which is this extraordinary shape that we all carry in our head right now, well, there would be nothing it is like to be anything. So for anything to really be something in and of itself, you must be conscious. And the more you are, and the more interestingly you are conscious, the more you really add literally something to the universe, add something that is in and of itself, and not just by virtual external observer. So that's sort of the rough idea, but I think we want, it immediately suggests ethical implications, like we want to give rise and the possibility of such enlightenment from inside that is adding entities that are in and of themselves to the universe is a value in itself. And as Christof said, we can also begin to extend that, if this is roughly in the right direction, down to animals and other creatures, because there is something it's like to be them. And that's a very important argument for respect.
Okay, let's move on then.
Thanks very much for those answers.
There are some questions down here.
A little more, perhaps grounded question to Larissa and Giulio about degeneracy, which I think is very interesting. In physics, when you have a degenerate system, you break that degeneracy either because you have internal dynamics, for example, a spin-orbit coupling in an atom, or because you have an external field that you can put into the system to break the degeneracy. And once you do that, you get this richness because you have all these extra energy levels that you didn't have before. So I'm wondering if the degeneracy that you were talking about could also be broken by some sort of internal mechanism that would enrich the way the brain can create new states.
So it's obviously a different kind of degeneracy, although there is something to the name. The degeneracy here is defined essentially as multiple ways to achieve the same effect. And in biology, it's actually a concept that was used by Jerry Edelman a lot in the context of immunology, is, I think, the idea of different things producing the same effect. It can be defined mathematically, as was done in the past, but the main point here is this. It's relevant especially in terms of richness with evolution. So in evolution, we see degeneracy everywhere in biology, meaning there are all kinds of different ways of doing the same thing. Now you could say this is redundancy, but it is not. It's precisely different because there are different ways to do the same thing. So it's redundant with respect to a particular function. But if you now change the environment, which happens all the time in evolution, so that unforeseen circumstances arise, now those different ways of doing the same function become new ways of doing something new. And that is an enormous advantage. While, perhaps we enjoy music, okay, that was not developed because it has any adaptive value in and of itself, but it becomes adaptive for people who make a career in it. It's a very simple-minded example of that. So the fact that evolution of actually integrated system, it's key actually that they are integrated, means that it's going to achieve some function in many different ways. To some extent, that's called tolerance, redundancy, but to a much more important extent, it's an insurance with respect to the future, because we're going to have new things that might act different in different situations.
Next question then, we have one next door.
My question is concerned with what I would maybe naively would take to be sort of a middle step between considering something as a physical system and considering consciousness, which would be simply to consider the question whether something is alive, in the sense that you have you have many physical systems, you have some that form a living organism, but some living organisms are not conscious and some are, I would say, and maybe this is a completely naive point of view, and then finally we have some living organisms which happen to be conscious, like humans and many others. So my question is this just a naive point of view, that before you can be conscious you would have to be alive, but not necessarily the other way around? Do
you maybe think that this is completely independent of each other, that you might be have consciousness without being alive, like a photodiode? Or if it is, then would there be some subset of your actions which would apply to all living beings, but with some additional postulates, especially for the case of consciousness? It would seem to me that a lot of living organisms, even a single cell, would show a lot of these integrated mechanisms and causal repertoire that you take to be typical for consciousness.
Okay, let's let the panel answer that one.
Okay, so one can address this question at several levels. One can address it at the level historically, when people wondered in the 19th century about the transition from the inorganic to the organic. Does it require special laws of physics, like Schrödinger thought? Is there a special substance, like other people thought, or does it just emerge in some unspecified way out of the laws of physics? We now know the latter is true. We can also address it at the level of making a division, a 2-by-2 table, where we have entries for living and non-living, and for conscious and non-conscious. And the implication of IIT seems to be that if you look at probably all cellular-based mechanisms, including, for example, a simple system as one of the simplest of all extant organisms is a bug called Genitalium mycoplasma. It has 512 genes only. It is already enormously complex. It's only last year that for the first time people could ever model such a cell. And it's a very highly complex system that nobody can actually understand. It requires a very large computer simulation. By any measure, that phi will be different from zero. It has heavily nonlinear feedback at all sorts of time scales. It's heavily and degenerate because of the highly interlocking time steps. So yeah, the theory does predict in the limit that such a system is also, that it feels like something to be the system. However, much less than your consciousness. Now, the analogy one can make is when you consider temperature, because most people will say, well, for heaven's sake, it's a bug, right? It doesn't feel like anything. Well, the only analogy I can think of is that if you think about temperature and you look at something like minus 270 degrees, 0.18, 1 degree above absolute zero, right? There's still some heat there, but it feels, as some people back east now know, it feels very, 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 very cold, but there's still some heat there. So that would be the analogy. But the theory says, yes, in principle, all these organisms have it feels like something to be them. And the theory, lastly, of course, also predicts that some conventional systems that are not alive, i.e. like certain types of physical system, could also be conscious.
Just to add to that, I listed...
Quickly, Max, please, quickly.
Yeah, I listed 5 principles that I was exploring, right? So it's interesting to check them off for life also. So information, well, certainly anything that has DNA in it stores information. So if life is going to have several generations, it has to store some info. Dynamics, well, if it ain't moving, most people wouldn't call it alive if it's not doing anything. Integration, that is open for discussion. Utility principles, certainly is sort of at the hallmark of Darwinian evolution. Independence, that's sort of less clear. You have some symbiotic systems where individual parts aren't so independent, but nonetheless would be argued to be alive. But I think most importantly, and I agree with Christof here, I get very annoyed when I see my son Philip's biology textbook and they have these definitions of life. It's the 2-by-2 table or whatever. It's either alive or it's not. Of course, there's a continuum. There's a phi. Take a range of values and whatever definitions you come up with life. Of course, some things in some sense should be able to be more alive than others. So I think we should leave. I'd rather leave detailed nitpicking about if it's meaningful to draw the boundary to this afternoon session, where we have a whole session dedicated to life.
Okay, let's move the microphone down this way. I think Anita had a question. If you could make it brief, please, because there are lots and lots of hands. And if you could make your answers brief as well, please, panel, that would be appreciated. Sorry to be so strict.
I think it's important, as we have all gathered here today to try to move this field forward, that we start to try to self-organize some rigorous definitions of a few things. Consciousness and conscious experience are are two things that have come up in this panel. Also information, life, what's living, what's not living. I think all these things have to be brought into some sort of rigorous definitions. I think one comment on this discussion, I think the people on this side of the table seem to be feeling or articulating consciousness as defined by conscious experience. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, the two of you have a broader definition of consciousness, which involves something that's not limited to a brain or a certain kind of organism. It's something intrinsic to nature or to reality. Is that correct, Federico? It seems
that's correct.
And so I think,
I also think that in the assumptions of Giulio, it may be found to be implicit that there has to be that property of nature.
Remember, the left side and right side are always unified, and I think on that score, as far as I can tell.
I truly hope I have the same definition of consciousness as Giulio, otherwise I would be in trouble later.
And was just saying, I think it's a state of matter, so I'm not limiting myself at all to biological system, to brains.
Yeah. So, but I think that it's important for the field to start to define this, because in one context, consciousness was developed, or the thinking of consciousness developed in the context of neuroscience or thinking or brains. And the other sense, there's a deeper concept of consciousness, which is more like information, which is a fundamental quality of nature itself. And I think we need to, as we move forward, start to put some more rigorous definitions on those.
Okay, thank you for your comment. Let's take another question. Brendan just said.
As a physicist, I'd like to ask the following question, because in physics, what's important with phenomena is scale, space-time scale or number scale, and so on. So here, I would like to ask Giulio, do you think that according to your axioms, consciousness happens in certain limited range of parameters, for example, spatial size? Can we think that a complex nucleus, or a big, galaxy, or galaxy clusters can have consciousness satisfying your actions?
Two answers. One, it can certainly happen at different spatial-temporal scales, in principle. Second, in practice, as Larissa showed briefly, the claim of the theory is that for any given system, there is going to be a maximum in space and time, so to speak, at which integrated information peaks. So for any given system, there is going to be that particular level that excludes the others. But for different systems, it may be very different spatial-temporal scales.
Okay, thank you. I think we should, there are lots more hands.
So we've heard about this 200 millisecond time scale, but I'm thinking of musicians who can bang out, drummers, piano players who can get 20 notes a second. Are they conscious of what they're doing?
Well, so your conscious experience is at a particular spatial and temporal scale at that moment. In principle, that could change over time too. It doesn't change from like a large range, but it could change to be in 1 millisecond and then being 100 milliseconds or 110 milliseconds. Most of the musicians that are actually very virtuous in what they do this unconsciously and would totally screw up if they started to think about what they do. That's why you train. The more you train, the more unconscious things become. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for the brevity of your question there. Adrian Kent.
I had a question for Larissa and maybe the rest of the panel. I'm still trying to understand this relationship between the microsystem and the macro level of its consciousness.
Well, we are too.
In your understanding of your person. I'm only thinking, if I describe the microsystem at one time completely, related to that, I could describe the microsystem at future times.
Yes.
From the next. But you you want to superimpose on that an idea about causality and how we assign causality that doesn't mean causality resides in like this system all the time. So you don't want to change the physical dynamics in any way, but you do want us to think differently about causality from the way the system used to. Is that roughly right?
Yes, it says that. So we agree that there is this micro level and there is nothing else happening on the macro level. Like you just coarse grain. But the important point to understand is that with the right causal measure, it's not true that the micro level is the one true level at which you should describe everything just because there is the most available information, but you should take the level where you have the highest effectiveness with respect to that state space.
Okay, let's bring the microphone down to Jeremy Butterfield.
Well, this is just a short ancillary comment that also in philosophy you have analyses that say that while the macro supervenes on the micro, there's lots of opportunity for macro causation and even macro down to micro level.
Yes, we just hope that we quantified it finally. Yeah.
Okay. More questions at the back. And if you could be brief, please, so that we can have more questions.
In your opinion, or within your models, is there anything like a social consciousness of collection of individual consciousnesses? And if so, how does it affect to the individual consciousness?
So if we take you and me, the theory says very clearly there's local maximum of integrated information in my brain, in your brain, so there would be no Übermind, there would not. So collectively here, there's no Übermind, right? Because we all, the theory says there's only a single maximum, it's the extremum principle across space, time, and granularity. So you look at one brain and two brain and three brain. Each time you compute the integrated information, you find here's a local maximum and there's a local maximum. However, you can imagine, and this is an experiment that could be done in the future, where my brain and Max's brains are beginning to be connected with some mechanisms. And as we increase the connectivity or the bandwidth of this mechanism, you can imagine at some point the amount of integrated information between us exceeds the amount of integrated information within me or within Max's brain. At that point, abruptly, Max would disappear and Christoph would disappear, and you would get a new conscious entity, a Max Christoph.
And they have actually done that the other way around with patients that had epilepsy, and they had to cut the corpus callosum between the two brain hemispheres, and there's convincing evidence that you then actually have two consciousnesses within one brain, and it's not the consciousness of the whole brain has gone.
So there is nothing like social consciousness?
No, it's excluded.
Not in this technical sense, no.
I would like to offer a perspective here. Consider an atom of sodium and an atom of chlorine. They can interact together. Okay, at best you can say, and then there are two conscious entities there. Let's say that they are conscious. Okay, they interact together. But there is a point when sodium and chlorine become a molecule of sodium chloride. At that point, new properties emerge, but they don't negate the fact that you have identities or selves in the atoms of sodium and the atom of chlorine. So I don't agree that when Max and Christoph fuse, they disappear. They don't disappear. They actually still exist as subsets, in a way, of a higher level conscious system. That's my perception of that.
Okay, thank you. We have another question at the back here.
Yeah, I was kind of intrigued by what you said, Federico, about consciousness being a field rather than a particle. I assume that's kind of where you're going. And it's like gravity is an emergent property of galaxies. If you don't look at it that way in physics, it's gravity caused the galaxies to form and so on. And so the idea that there's undiscovered physics I find pretty intriguing. In other words, math isn't necessarily in the chalk, and you get an emergent property due to a new law of physics. So in other words, I guess the right side of the panel, I would say, is arguing that we have sufficient physics to explain consciousness and going on that assumption. And you're saying we need new physics.
But I'm not sure that they actually do that. Let's ask that question explicitly.
Giulio?
Giulio?
The idea is that consciousness is a special property, just like mass and charge, which doesn't require extra things. It just requires a mechanism in a state that constrains its past and its future in a particular way. You make what you want of it. You know, do you say this is an addition to physics? Well, it's a property that must be recognized. Or you say, well, this doesn't really require any spooky substance on top of what we know, and I would agree with that.
Also, I want to have a last comment on the emergence story, because I think many people think that consciousness somehow emerges. But what I wanted to show is that it's not actually consciousness that emerges from the physical substrate. Its consciousness is identical to the information, the integrated information of the macro level, and the macro physical level is what emerges from the micro physical level. So it's not consciousness that somehow emerges, it's the macro level that emerges at which consciousness runs.
My guess is that we probably don't need new physics, and based on an analogy with computation, if you take computronium, again, this old phrase for the most general substance that can compute, what we've learned from universality, like Scott summarized in his nice talk, is that it doesn't even matter very much what kind of stuff you have, as long as it has certain basic traits. It can compute anything. And it seems to me like an interesting and plausible hypothesis worth pursuing, that we have a similar universality principle for consciousness. You can build consciousness out of a variety of different kinds of physical substrates. They just have to meet certain minimum requirements. And so I think it's very interesting to see how far can we get with the physics that we already know, and we certainly haven't pushed that to the limits.
Can we have one more question? Just, we've got 5 minutes left, so I'd love to be able to squeeze another question in if possible.
Wouldn't that minimum line be chemical communication?
Be what?
The minimum line be chemical communication to define consciousness.
Why should it be?
A mechanism that chemically communicates.
I don't see why chemistry should play
Why not
any
physics?
Important.
Well, what's special about chemistry that physics doesn't have?
I mean, any kind of causal interaction works.
Francesca has a question over on the other side.
My question maybe follows from the previous one, because I want to ask about communication again, and what is the relation between consciousness and the fact that a system that identifies itself as an identity, as this was one of the properties of consciousness that was listed before. What is the importance of the identity that communicates with the rest of the environment around it? Is it a necessary feature or not? I mean, my impression is that it should be, for instance, there was this example of the dreams in which apparently the person is just in his own world, but it seems to me that this kind of feature that arises because consciousness first appear two interactions of the
evolutionary, there's no question we're social animals and we need to interact, so it's difficult to imagine how in the course of evolution this could have evolved without social interaction. However, as you mentioned, there are many...
not social, even just communication.
Within the brain, or... No, of course.
No brains, just the system, even maybe...
Oh, interacting with an environment in general. Yeah, of course, we have to interact with an environment at evolutionary scale in order to have the representation that allow us to manipulate the environment and to survive in it. Otherwise, you wouldn't have survived. So that requires a constant interaction with the environment. In fact, a mapping, a matching of information in the environment onto information present in the representation the system has of the external world. We also require this developmentally. Although once you're developed, as you said, there are many conditions like lock-in syndrome, other clinical cases, or your dreams when your interaction with the environment is reduced to minimum. Probably not zero, but reduced to a minimum.
Okay, let's take a question from Scott Aronson, if it's brief, then Anthony, and then we'll finish up there.
What's the deal with people who don't like chocolate? Is it that they taste something different than everyone else, or is it that they taste the same thing, but they don't like it?
No, they have different types of receptor. I mean, we all have different types of receptor. Just like you're not, if you're colorblind, you're not. Max tells me he's colorblind. He's unable to perceive certain types of color, right? He just doesn't have the hardware that allow him to make that proper discrimination. These people, unfortunately, don't have the right sort of taste receptor to make that discrimination that most of us really enjoy. They miss out.
And kiwi tastes terribly bitter to me. Go figure.
But it's also a matter of which associations you form during your development. Like if you have a concept that puts chocolate together with something disgusting, then you probably won't like it, even though it tastes the same.
Yeah, I wanted to probe a little bit more in this question that there was an exchange about whether when you have sort of two different, maybe multiple systems with consciousness that then get integrated into some higher level, they're somehow extinguished in the consciousness. And I wanted to push on that a bit, and the general idea that consciousness can only happen sort of in a unitary way. Because I do get concerned, you know, how do we know really that there isn't some small level? You have this nice quantitative or spectrum of levels of consciousness. Why isn't there some small level of social consciousness we're experiencing simultaneously with ours? Or that, you know, the different hemispheres of our brain aren't still being conscious right now. And the thing that I worry a little bit about is that evolutionarily we are fine-tuned for survival, and there's a single organism, and could it be that our propensity to experience a single consciousness, you know, at a time is more of an artificial and evolutionary artifact than something that's intrinsic to consciousness in sort of an axiomatic way?
But you do have the causal interactions. We're not like saying that the causal interactions don't exist. So you cannot go from functionality to say that you need a consciousness, a higher level consciousness on top of the two single ones, because the causal interactions still exist. We don't say they don't. So the reason to, I mean, one reason is the phenomenology to say you experience only one, you don't experience an overlap of consciousness. If you don't, yeah, right. The other argument to go is causal exclusion. You would have multiple causation if you would think that those different levels would all agree. And by Occam's razor, we should just not do this.
I think Federico has a comment.
Let me offer again a perspective here. You know, if you cut the corpus callosum, you have essentially two cells. Okay. Now the corpus callosum now is reconnected. Let's say. Now, if you look at yourself, your own inner experience, you find that you have inner conflicts. You're not unitary, really. Okay. You think, oh, maybe this or maybe that, and you're really flipping between different representations. So those selves are already there. Now, eventually, you make a decision, which is a unified decision. But that's the claim that, like, the sodium and chlorine are still identities. They don't disappear. They are part of the molecule.
Yes, but the person that experiences the conflict is unified. Otherwise, there couldn't be experience.
Yeah, but that experience contains also the experience of the other two. You cannot experience their own experience as a unified entity.
Federico,
You know?
I have to differ you. The experimental evidence shows in the split brain patient that the patient actually does have access to information from, so typically when you talk to a split brain patient, you talk to the left hemisphere, the speaking one. It turns out the patient has access to the information from the other, the non-dominant one, but is not aware of it. So the patient will make appropriate responses, but then has no idea why he's making that response. He's not conscious of it. So all the evidence we have suggests there are two conscious entities inside a single skull, and nobody, at least experimentally, has ever been able to access a higher personality that has been eliminated by the surgical cut. Maybe it's there, but nobody's ever queried this higher level personality. You can only query the left and the right hemisphere.
Yeah, but once they are connected, okay. Reconnected, all right.
That hasn't been done.
Well, no, I know that it's not been done, but you can do a thought experiment, right? That you can reconnect it, okay. Then you can assume that that consciousness of the two right and brain hemispheres still exists.
No, they're
let me finish. Still exists, and then you have now a new unitary consciousness, which is the consciousness of what you now perceive as you, that before was split. There were two separate yous. And that consciousness has the information and requires the information, the integrated information of the other two consciousnesses in order for you, the you which is integrated, to experience what you experience. And that manifests often as a conflict between the two aspects of yourself.
Okay, I think we've opened a really lively debate there just as we've come to the end. I think you should give yourselves a round of applause. And now I think you should give an even bigger round of applause to our panel.
This is the one case where